Our next speaker is Hans von Spakovsky. He's an attorney and former member of the Board of Advisors for the Federal Election Commission. He's a staff member here at Heritage Foundation, and he has just written a book called Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. Anytime a fraudulent vote is cast, your legitimate vote is undervalued. So I hope that Mr. von Spakovsky can help us alleviate this situation. Go ahead.
All right, well, Stan Evans is pretty tough to follow. I don't think I have the jokes and stories that he does. But I am talking to you about a serious subject. You know, I often write for National Review magazine, and John Fund is their national correspondent. So we wrote this book, and the whole point of it was to upset the left and point out that voter fraud is something that actually does occur. And you know, what's amazing about that is if you Google me, you will find some of the worst stuff you could possibly imagine, and it's all because of the fact that when voter fraud cases occur, I actually write about them. Now, the biggest thing that you all have heard is that even when voter fraud happens, why it's so rare and it doesn't really do anything. Okay, well, I'm going to tell you about two cases that you all probably don't know about that affected you and every other single American in this room. Now, I don't know if you all have read about this, but just a little while ago, 4 individuals were convicted by a jury in Indiana for engaging in ballot petition fraud. Now, why is this important and why does it affect you? Well, because the county Democratic Party chairman in a particular county in Indiana was convicted of forging the signatures back in 2008 of the petitions that got Barack Obama qualified to be on the ballot for the Democratic May 2008 primary. Now, in Indiana, like in a lot of other states, you've got to get a certain number of voter signatures to get on the ballot. In Indiana, you have to get 500 registered voters from each of the state's congressional districts. And in this particular congressional district where this county chairman is, they forged page after page after page of the ballot petition. Now, did local authorities discover this? No, in fact, some of the local authorities were involved in it. This was discovered by a college student who got a hold of the petitions and was looking at them and said, you know, a lot of these signatures look the same. Now, why is this important? Because if you go back to May of 2008, remember there was a very hot presidential race going on between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. At the time of the Indiana primary, Barack Obama had 1,490 delegates. Hillary Clinton had 1,338 delegates, so she was very close behind Obama, and in fact, she was ahead of him in the super delegates that are also go to the Democratic Convention. Now, she barely won the Indiana primary. She won it by 51%. But what that meant was that she and Obama split the delegates from that state. So it was basically a washout. If instead he had been challenged, and the signature forgery had been discovered then, he would not have been on the ballot. Now, can you imagine what a fiasco that would have been if a major Democratic candidate wasn't on the ballot in a big state like Indiana? Hillary Clinton had won, had gotten all 72 delegates. What would that have done to his campaign? You know, he was not the set nominee at the time. Like I said, it was a hot race, and this might have been something that stopped his momentum and allowed Hillary Clinton to become the nominee. We'll never know. But that fraud affected everyone because it potentially helped get Barack Obama elected. Another piece of voter fraud that affected every person in this room is the fact that in 2008, you all may recall, we had one of the closest Senate races in United States history in Minnesota. 2.9 million votes were cast, and on Election Day, the Republican incumbent, Norm Coleman, was ahead by a little over 700 votes. Now, the challenger Democrat Al Franken, former Saturday Night Live comedian. He was on Saturday Night Live when I was in high school, so that tells a little bit about how old I am. He went to court to challenge the race. And after months and months of litigation, after a number of recounts, there's a whole chapter in this book about the race, Al Franken was declared the winner by a little over 300 votes. Now, what we have discovered since then is that the winning margin was a little over 300 votes. Well, we now know that between 1,200 and 1,400 felons illegally voted in that election. So the illegal votes were 4 times the margin of victory. And why did that affect you if you're not from Minnesota? Because Al Franken provided the 60th vote that passed Obamacare in the Senate. So if Al Franken had not won that race, there would be no Obamacare legislation that is now law in the U.S. The point of all this is that, look, we generally have a pretty good election system, but we do have fraud, and it does occur. And it's something we've got to fight against all the time. That's one of the reasons states have been pushing for voter ID laws, is to stop that from happening. And to tell you how much the left does not like this. There was an article that appeared in a magazine I'm sure I would never ordinarily recommend that you read, called Mother Jones. Have you heard of it? It's probably the most left-wing magazine there is, right? Well, they had an interesting article in January of this year. One of their reporters made it into a meeting that was held in Washington a month after the election. It was held at the offices of the National Education Association. And at the meeting, everybody always talks about the vast right-wing conspiracy. Well, this was actually the vast left-wing conspiracy having this meeting. 36 of the most powerful liberal advocacy groups and unions were at this meeting. Everyone from the NEA to the AFL-CIO, the SEIU, the Sierra Club, People for the American Way. And the whole point of this meeting was how to pool their money and come up with a strategy for their goal, which is to turn the United States into their version of a progressive liberal utopia. And they set out 3 objectives. The first objective was to get rid of the filibuster rule in the Senate so that they can ram through legislation and nominees, including judicial nominees. And by the way, the second goal was to oppose all voter ID laws and any other efforts to improve the integrity of the election process. Now, what does that tell you about them? It tells you that they are willing to break the rules to win, and they don't want any rules in place that will make that more difficult to occur. The point of this is that you're hearing today from lots of people talking to you about the kind of public policy solutions we want for the problems we have. Well, we're not going to be able to put those, our ideas for solving those problems in place unless we elect the right people to office. And conservatives who often think that as long as everybody follows the rules, we'll be able to elect our folks, don't understand that the left believes that it's okay to cheat because the end justifies the mean. So what I would say to all of you is, if you're not working in a campaign on Election Day, then go get a job as a precinct worker and work in the polls, because having you there is one way of stopping that kind of fraud from happening. Or if you're not going to do that, volunteer to be a poll watcher so you can do that. And in the states where you live, convince your state legislators to do things like pass photo ID laws, because they are very, very important. And now I'll be happy to answer questions.
Oh, good. Yes, right in front here.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. My name's Kevin Kane. I'm from Pennsylvania. And I don't know if you're aware, but we've had voter ID and fraud issues there for a while now.
Yes.
The state legislature actually passed voter ID law, and it had a lot of support in the state, but it was overturned by liberal courts. And also, there was one district in the 2012 election outside of Philadelphia that voted 92,000 votes for Obama and 0 for Mitt Romney. So I think it's like pretty grossly obvious. How do we combat something like that when the courts are so active? Like we had legislation there, legislation that seemed like it would work, and then it was overturned by the courts. What's your suggestion, like, for situations like that?
Yeah, no, I'm very aware of the Pennsylvania situation.